My son drove 4 hours and placed a signed contract on the table between us. "Dad, I need you to see what I actually signed." The words were printed in cold, legal language reduced external family contact. I was the external. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him to leave. I just looked at him and said, "You kept this for 2 years. Some part of you always knew." What he said next was something I never expected a grown man to say about himself. But to understand how we got to that table, I need to go back to the beginning. My name is Ray Calloway. I'm 63 years old and I spent most of my adult life as a family physician in this city, which means I spent 30 years watching people navigate the worst and most ordinary moments of their lives from a chair 3 feet away. I retired early 2 years ago after a minor cardiac event that was less dramatic than it sounds, but sufficient to make me reconsider what I was doing and why. My doctor, who is 37 years old and used to be my patient, told me my heart was structurally fine and that what I needed was less schedule. She was right. I tell you the medicine because I think it explains something about how I process things. 30 years of diagnosis teaches you not to react to the first symptom. You gather information. You look at the whole picture. You resist the pull toward the explanation that feels most obvious, because the most obvious explanation is often not the correct one. The evening I found out about James, I tried to do that. I tried to be measured. But 14 months is a long time to be kept from something you didn't know existed. So, I went back inside and started gathering information. Marcus was my only child. His mother Diane and I divorced when he was 10. Not a violent ending, just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had built something that no longer fit either of them. We handled it, as well as people handle those things. Diane moved to Charlotte, remarried within a few years, built a life that suited her better. Marcus stayed with me during the school year and spent summers moving between both houses. I won't pretend that arrangement was seamless. There were years where Marcus was angry at me, in the way sons get angry at fathers who are present without quite being available. I worked long hours. I missed things. I was the kind of father who showed up physically, but sometimes left his attention at the office. The summer Marcus turned 16, he told me during an argument that I treated the house like a hotel. I didn't say anything back, partly because I didn't have a good answer and partly because he wasn't entirely wrong. There was a stretch when he was about 14 where he barely spoke at dinner. Not hostile, just gone somewhere internal where I couldn't follow. I tried different approaches. I suggested we do things on weekends, fishing on the Ogeechee day trips down to the coast. He'd come without much enthusiasm, then usually seemed glad he had once we got there. I learned not to ask if he wanted to go. I just said we were going and he'd get in the truck. The thing that turned it, or started to turn it, was a night in his junior year when he came home from school with a lab result from his AP biology class that he'd gotten wrong. He was furious about it, not at me, just furious in general, and he spread the whole assignment out on the kitchen table and walked me through where his reasoning had failed. We sat there for 2 hours, going over cell biology that I barely remembered from 30 years earlier. By the end, he had figured out his mistake, and I had relearned something I should have kept in better shape. We didn't talk about anything important, but something in the room was different after that. What I did instead was try to change it. Gradually, imperfectly, the way people change when they're doing it without a plan. I started leaving the office earlier. I started asking questions that required more than one-word answers. When Marcus decided he wanted to go to medical school, I didn't push him toward it the way some fathers might. I let him arrive at it himself, and then tried to be useful once he had. I wrote him a letter when he got into Emory. Not a text. A letter on paper that said the things I was not naturally good at saying out loud. He kept it. I know because I saw it once in a frame on his desk when I visited his apartment during residency. We were never a father and son who said everything out loud. But I believed we understood each other. I believed that what we had built across those years, through the arguments and the silences and the graduations and the late-night phone calls from his residency, When he was exhausted and doubting himself, I believed that was real and solid, and not the kind of thing that just quietly disappeared. Then Marcus met Renee Whitfield. She was a hospital administrator, efficient and sharp-minded, the kind of person who enters a room already knowing the layout. The first time I met her was at a dinner Marcus organized at a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta. Good food, careful conversation, everyone on their best behavior. She was impressive. I told Marcus that afterward and meant it. Her father, Gerald Whitfield, I met 3 months later. Gerald was a corporate attorney, semi-retired, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where he was the most important person present and had never quite figured out how to turn that off. He was courteous to me in the way that some men are courteous to people they've already assessed and filed away. He asked about my practice with the interest of someone checking a box. I remember thinking he reminded me of a patient type. I had learned to be careful with the kind who comes in, having already decided what's wrong with them, and needs you to confirm it. I probably should have paid more attention to that instinct. The distance came gradually, the way these things do. Marcus called less frequently after the wedding. When he did call, the conversations were shorter, more surface level, the kind where you cover the expected topics and hang up feeling like you've spoken without actually talking. I told myself it was the natural compression of a new marriage, a demanding career, a life that was filling up with obligations that were his and Renee's together, and didn't leave much room for a father 4 hours down, I-16. I adjusted. I stopped suggesting visits as often. I waited for him to reach out. I told myself this was what a reasonable father did. Then, one Christmas went by without an invitation. I found out afterward that Gerald and his wife had hosted everyone at their house in Buckhead. Marcus texted me on Christmas morning. "Hope your day is good, Dad. Talk soon." I stared at that message for a while before I answered it. Yeah, that one registered. Later that evening, after I'd sent back a short reply and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter, I got in my car. I told myself I was going to get coffee from the place on Drayton that stays open late. But I drove past it without stopping. I ended up on a street about 20 minutes from my house, the kind of neighborhood that looks especially full of itself at Christmas porch lights, on wreaths on every door, the particular warm glow that only comes from a house where people are gathered inside and nobody is missing. I sat in the car with the engine running for longer than I should have. Not watching exactly. Just sitting with the understanding that somewhere in that city, my son was having Christmas dinner and had not thought to include me in the planning. That was not a suspicion or an interpretation. That was simply a fact. I drove home. I made dinner by myself. I did not call anyone, but I let it pass. I made myself let it pass. I had enough self-awareness to recognize that my judgment about Gerald Whitfield might not be entirely objective, that I was capable of reading slights into situations that were just the ordinary reconfiguration of a young family finding its shape. I didn't want to be the father who poisoned his son's marriage with his own insecurities. So I said nothing. I kept calling. I kept sending birthday checks that came back as 3-line thank you texts. I kept being easy to deprioritize. The LinkedIn post ended that. I went to bed around 11 that night but didn't sleep. I lay in the dark going over the past 2 years with the particular clarity that insomnia produces not emotional, just systematic, the way you review a case when you realize you've been treating the wrong thing. Every canceled plan, every conversation that ended before it started, every time Marcus had sounded slightly careful, like someone choosing words in a language they're not fully comfortable in. Around 4 in the morning, I got up, made coffee, and went to the study. I keep a legal pad on the desk. Old habit, I always thought better writing things down than typing them. I drew a line down the center of the page and wrote 2 headings. Left side, what I had given. Right side, what I had received. The left column took a while to fill. The years of tuition and living expenses through medical school. The down payment help when Marcus and Renee bought their house in Decatur. The times I had driven to Atlanta to help with something that turned out not to need much help, a leaking faucet, some furniture assembly, because I understood those calls were less about the faucet, and more about wanting company, and I had always gone. The standing offer to cover any gap if his resident salary came up short, which he had taken me up on twice, without either of us making it a larger conversation than it needed to be. The right column was shorter calls, shorter visits, Christmas in Buckhead without me. And now, 14 months of a grandson I didn't know existed. I sat there with the pen in my hand and thought about the word deliberate. Some silences are accidental. They accumulate through inattention and busyness, and the thousand small failures of people who mean well. But some silences are constructed. They require maintenance. They require that everyone in the room agrees, at least implicitly, not to say the thing. A 14-month silence about a child is the second kind. I turned the page and wrote a name, Helen Marsh. Helen had handled the legal work when I sold my practice 2 years earlier. She was methodical, direct, and did not tell me what I wanted to hear, qualities I valued in attorneys. For the same reason, I valued them in physicians. I wrote myself a note to call her office when it opened. But I didn't make the call that morning, because at 2:17 in the morning, 9 days after I found the LinkedIn post, my phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice was off immediately. Not in a crisis way, not frightened or urgent, but loose, slightly imprecise. He'd been drinking. Not badly, but enough. I could hear it in the way he started a sentence and found a slightly different ending than the one he'd been aiming for. He said he needed to talk. I told him I was listening. What followed was not a confession in the formal sense. It was more like a pressure valve, releasing things coming out in the wrong order, with too much detail in some places, and not enough in others, the way things come out when someone has been holding them down for long enough that the holding becomes more exhausting than the telling. The short version was this. 2 years into Marcus and Renee's marriage, they had accumulated a significant amount of debt, medical school loans that had been restructured badly, combined with a period where Renee had left one job before she had another lined up. The number was not catastrophic, but it was the kind of number that changes how you sleep. Gerald had offered to eliminate it. The condition, as Marcus described it that night, had not been stated explicitly. Gerald was too careful for explicit conditions. What he had said, according to Marcus, was that he hoped the money would give them the space to build their own foundation as a family. That he wanted them to be able to make their own decisions without outside financial pressures. That he had always believed young couples needed room to develop their own center, without too many competing influences. Marcus said he had understood what that meant. He said he had told himself it was reasonable. That Gerald wasn't asking him to do anything harmful, just to create some natural distance. That I was capable of taking care of myself. That the money was too significant to turn down for the sake of phone calls that were becoming harder to make anyway. He said Renee had agreed it was the right decision. He said he had told himself that every month for 2 years. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Outside my window, Savannah was doing what it does at 2 in the morning in early fall. The air through the screen smelled of Confederate jasmine from the neighbor's fence, and somewhere down the block, a dog was making a periodic comment about something only it could hear. When Marcus finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know why I'm calling you." I told him I did. We said very little after that. He wasn't in a state for a real conversation, and I understood that what had just happened needed room to settle before either of us tried to build on it. I told him to get some water and some sleep. I told him we'd talk when he was ready. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." That was all. I sat in the study for a long time after the call ended. The sky outside was still fully dark, maybe an hour, before the first gray light would start at the edge of things. I didn't move to make more coffee. I just sat there with the phone face down on the desk and the legal pad open in front of me, and I let the silence do what silence does when you stop fighting it. The thing that kept returning was not the money, though the money was clarifying in its own way, the way a diagnosis is clarifying even when the news isn't good. It was the image of Marcus sitting across a table from Gerald Whitfield, understanding exactly what was being offered and what it would cost, and deciding that I was the thing he could afford to lose. I had treated patients for 30 years who made that same calculation about their own health, told themselves the symptom was manageable, that addressing it would cost too much, that they could carry it a little longer. Most of them were wrong. Some of them waited too long to find out. There was no anger in what I felt sitting at that desk. What I felt was something older and quieter than anger, the particular weight of a man who has just understood that the structure he believed in was built on an assumption that was never fully tested. The assumption was that love, if it was real, would hold its shape on its own. 30 years of medicine had taught me otherwise. Structures hold because they are maintained. When the maintenance stops, the holding stops. Quietly, gradually, and then all at once. I understood how that happened with Marcus. Gerald had offered a solution to a real problem, framed it in language that made compliance sound like maturity, and let the silence accumulate until it became its own kind of normal. Young couples under financial pressure make compromises that they tell themselves are temporary. Then the compromise becomes the condition, and the condition becomes invisible because it's been there long enough. But understanding how something happens doesn't mean you have to live inside it. I called Helen Marsh's office when it opened. Her office was on Liberty Street in a building that had been a cotton warehouse in a previous century, and still had the bones to prove it. High ceilings, thick walls, the slight coolness of old brick even in summer heat. She listened to everything with the focused attention of someone billing by the hour who is actually worth it. When I finished, she asked me one question: "What do you want the outcome to look like?" I had thought about that through the long night. I told her I wanted to revise my will. I wanted a meaningful portion of the estate redirected to 2 medical scholarship funds I had quietly supported for years, programs that sent students from lower-income families through the kind of training that had shaped my own life. That felt like the right place for it. I wanted a trust established for James, my grandson, with independent management. Something that would be there for his education and his early footing as an adult, and that no one else could redirect or leverage for their own purposes. That was important to me. Whatever had happened between the adults in his family, he was 14 months old and had done nothing wrong. As for Marcus, he would still receive part of the estate, but less than what had been written before. Not as punishment, as a reflection of the actual relationship rather than the one I had been pretending existed. Helen wrote notes, asked a few precise questions, and told me we could have the documents drafted by end of week. The process was uncomplicated. I was in and out in 90 minutes, walking back to my car through the squares under the live oaks, with their Spanish moss moving slightly in whatever air was coming off the river. I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness. Not relief exactly, more like the settling sensation of a building that has been shimmed back to level. Something was where it was supposed to be. The following morning I did something that required no attorney. I wrote a letter to Marcus by hand on the good stationery that had been sitting in my desk drawer since I retired. Not long, 3 paragraphs. I told him I had heard what he said. I told him I understood more than he might expect. I told him the door on my side was not closed, but that I needed him to know what had been lost while that door appeared to be open. I sealed it and mailed it. Then I stopped reaching out. No texts, no calls, no checking in. I simply let the space go quiet and waited to see what filled it. What filled it about 2 weeks later was Gerald Whitfield. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, without calling first, which was either a calculated choice or an arrogance so settled it had stopped recognizing itself. I saw his car from the upstairs window, a dark sedan Buckhead Money, parked with precision in front of my house on Jones Street. I met him on the front steps, rather than inviting him in. Small decision, but it was mine to make. Gerald was courteous, as he always was. He said he hoped I was well. He said he understood there had been some tension in the family recently, and that he wanted to speak man to man. He said he admired directness. I told him I did too. He said he thought perhaps I had misunderstood the nature of the financial arrangement he had made with Marcus and Renee. That it had been a gift freely given with no strings attached. That any perception of conditions was an unfortunate misreading of what had been a generous gesture. I looked at him for a moment. I told him that I was a physician for 30 years, and that the one thing medicine taught me above everything else was the difference between a symptom and a cause. I told him that the symptom was 14 months. The cause was a conversation he had in his kitchen in Buckhead with my son, dressed up as advice. Gerald's composure held. He said he thought it might be wise for me to reconsider any legal decisions I had made in a difficult emotional moment. I told him the decisions had been made in a very calm moment early on a September morning with full sleep and a clear head. He left shortly after that. That evening, I called Helen and told her to finalize everything. Well, there are conversations that close doors and conversations that open them. That one closed a door that needed closing. 3 weeks passed. Then Marcus called again sober, this time in the middle of a Sunday afternoon with the careful deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed the dial, but not the conversation. He asked if we could meet. I told him yes, but not at a restaurant, not somewhere neutral and managed. I told him to come to Savannah. He drove down the following Saturday 4 hours from Atlanta and arrived at my door in the early afternoon, looking like someone who had been awake since before the drive started. We sat on the back porch with coffee. The garden was still green from a wet September, and the light through the old oak at the back of the yard came through, at the angle it only gets in early fall, low, and sideways and very clear. Marcus put an envelope on the table between us. Inside was a document, a financial agreement signed 2 years earlier between Gerald Whitfield and Marcus Calloway, outlining the terms of a debt settlement in exchange for what the document called a period of reduced external family contact during the foundational years of the Whitfield-Calloway household. Those were the actual words. Reduced external family contact. I was the external. Marcus had asked Gerald for a copy 3 weeks earlier. Gerald had refused. So Marcus had found the copy he had signed and kept, which he had apparently been unable to throw away for 2 years, and which had been sitting in a folder in his filing cabinet in Decatur, while he told himself the arrangement was reasonable. He slid it across the table and said, "I need you to see this. I need you to see what I actually signed." I looked at the document. I read it carefully. Then I set it down. I told him the document confirmed what I already knew. That wasn't what mattered. He asked what mattered. I told him you kept it. 2 years you kept it. Some part of you understood from the beginning that this wasn't something you should be able to forget. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the sentence that I have turned over many times since Dad. There's no version of this where I'm not the one who made the choice. Gerald offered. I accepted. That's on me. He didn't say I was manipulated or I was under pressure or it seemed reasonable at the time. He said I made the choice. I had raised a son who, when pushed to the edge of honesty, told the truth about himself. That mattered. We talked for 4 hours that afternoon. Some of it was hard in the way that necessary conversations are hard, not because anyone was shouting, but because we were both staying in the room with things we would have preferred not to look at directly. I told him what the 14 months had felt like. Not abstractly, not as an accusation, just specifically. That I had learned James could walk before I knew James existed. That somewhere in those 14 months, there had been a first word, a first laugh, a first time someone held him up to a window to look at something outside, and I had not been any part of it. Marcus listened to all of that without flinching, which took more than I expected it to. He told me what the 2 years had felt like from his side, the accumulating discomfort, the way Gerald's logic had seemed more reasonable each time it was repeated, the way Renee had gradually come to accept it as simply how things were in their family. He said there had been a moment about 8 months in when he had almost called me. He'd been driving back from the hospital late, and he'd picked up the phone and found my name and held it for a while before putting it down. He said he didn't know what stopped him exactly. He thought it was that he had already been quiet so long that speaking felt like it would require explaining the silence first, and he didn't know how to do that. I told him he had just done it. He said Renee had called her father the previous week. He said the conversation had not gone the way Gerald expected. I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my conversation to own. Before Marcus left, I told him the will had been revised and would stay revised. That the structure of it reflected where things actually stood, and that I wasn't interested in pretending that 2 years could be undone by one good afternoon. He said he understood. He didn't ask me to change it back, which told me something. He hugged me at the door in the particular way that men hug when they've said something real and don't have anything left to add. I watched his car pull away down Jones Street and stood there for a minute in the late afternoon light. Then I went inside and called Helen and told her she could file everything. The will stayed exactly as written. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. It was not a temporary measure, not a punishment waiting to be lifted once behavior improved. It was a document written to reflect the actual shape of things, rather than the shape I had been carrying around in my head. The scholarship funds would receive what they would receive. James's trust was independent and protected. Marcus would receive something real, but not the everything that the previous version had assumed. I had spent 30 years in medicine, understanding that accurate diagnosis was not cruelty. It was the necessary condition for any treatment to work. Gerald Whitfield did not come back to Savannah. I heard through Marcus that he was managing his reaction with the composure of a man who understood he had overplayed something and was recalibrating. According to Marcus, Renee had told her father that the decisions in their household were hers and Marcus's to make, and that his financial involvement in their lives was finished. I didn't know the full conversation. I didn't need to. 6 weeks after that Saturday afternoon on the porch, Marcus and Renee drove down with James. I had not seen a photograph. Marcus had offered to send one, and I had told him I'd rather wait. I wanted the first time to be real, rather than a preview of real. Renee, I had not spoken to directly since before any of this. She stepped through the front door first, a few feet ahead of Marcus, and for a moment, she just stood in the hallway, looking at me with the expression of someone who has rehearsed an opening line and decided at the last second to abandon it entirely. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive. There were things behind her eyes she hadn't said yet, and clearly knew she hadn't said. She shook my hand, firm, deliberate, the handshake of someone who understands that a gesture can carry more than words when the words aren't ready yet. Then she said, "I owe you a conversation we haven't had yet." I told her there was time. She nodded, and something in her shoulders settled slightly, the way people settle when they've been bracing for a door to stay closed, and it opens instead. Marcus carried James through the front door. He was 16 months old, solid and alert, with Marcus's forehead and eyes I didn't recognize from anyone in particular yet. He looked at me the way children that age look at new faces, with a complete, unsentimental assessment. No social performance in it, just information gathering. Marcus set him down on the hallway floor. For a moment, James stood there, one hand on Marcus's leg, looking at me. Then he let go and walked across the floor toward me, with the tremendous concentration of someone who has recently mastered a skill and is still proud of it every single time. I crouched down to his level. He stopped about 2 feet away and studied me. "Hello," I said. "I'm your grandfather." He reached out and grabbed my thumb with his whole fist and held on. That was enough. That was more than enough. The year since then has not been simple. Repair never is, and I'm old enough to stop expecting otherwise. There are conversations Marcus and I still need to have, and some visits that have been easier than others, and moments where I can feel both of us navigating the new geography of what we are now, not the father and son of assumption, but two people who have seen something real between them and are choosing with full knowledge of the alternative to try again. But we are trying. That is the difference. Most Saturdays now, I drive up to Atlanta, or they drive down to Savannah. James has developed strong opinions about the oak tree in my backyard, which he treats as a personal project, picking up acorns, examining them, occasionally attempting to return them to the tree by pressing them against the bark, which has a logic I understand, even if it doesn't quite work. Last month, I sold the house on Jones Street. I had been thinking about it for a while. It was more house than I needed, and the equity made more sense in motion than sitting still. The couple who bought it were young, newly married, and made an offer the same afternoon they walked through. Before I handed over the keys, I asked them if I could spend one morning in the garden. They said yes without hesitation, which I found generous. I brought James that morning. The September light was doing what September light does in Savannah gold, and lo, making everything look more permanent than it is. I walked him around the garden and told him the names of things. The Confederate jasmine on the back fence. The old camellia in the corner that blooms in January when nothing else does. The oak that he had already decided was his. He repeated some of the words back to me with varying accuracy. Jasmine came out as something with a Z in it. The oak he just pointed at, and said his own word for it, which I didn't try to correct. We sat on the back steps for a while before we left. James was in my lap, working on an acorn he'd found near the base of the oak. The house was already somebody else's, but the light through the trees was the same light it had always been falling through, the same branches at the same angle. It fell every September morning in this yard. I thought about the LinkedIn post, the 14 months, the 2 in the morning phone call, the document on the porch table. I thought about my son saying I was the one who made the choice. Some things that break don't go back together the way they were. They go back together differently with the break visible present part of what the thing now is. I had spent 30 years as a physician, understanding that scar tissue, for all its limitations, was also proof of something that had healed. I held my grandson in the garden of the house I was leaving, and I let that be what it was. It was enough.